And so I'm going to walk everyone through one, like what brain computer interfaces are, a background of where they've been applied in, the cases that we've seen them work in, and what possibilities exist when we merge advances in, neuroscience, technology, and also like even psychology, really, in terms of understanding ourselves and how the brain works. And so a little about me, I think here I gave a very good introduction. I was born and raised in Nigeria. I currently work in Vancouver here with the Experiences and Devices team. It's pretty interesting because I grew up actually wanting to be a neurosurgeon. So if you asked me like when I was like 10, 11, 12, even up until like 17 or so, I'd have probably told you, oh, I want to be a neurosurgeon. But then I was always good with computers. And so I guess computers won, if you want to put it that way. And going through college, I got introduced to machine learning way in like 2017. And at the time, it was still, one computer vision, for example, was still like people writing algorithms. Now it's mostly people just throwing stuff at deep learning and networks. Um, but beyond that, also, it's also for me that exist when we merge these advances in neural networks or machine learning in these different fields. And so I came back to my interest later in 2019 when I ran my first neuroscience experiment. And since then, I've just been kind of, playing around with it, learning a bit more, asking people questions. And so I'm going to dive in a bit. First, I'll give a little introduction into how the brain works, and then I'll go into types of brain interfaces that exist, how people are using them, and how, if you were going to work on a project, what you would do when getting started. And so we get started with like how the brain works, right? I think if everyone's heard like the brain is like one of the most complex things that ever existed in the world, but also still the most powerful, really. And a quick intro here would be me talking from the point of how the brain is kind of split up. On the outer parts of our brain, we have this thing called the cerebral cortex. And we can kind of break it down into a couple bits here, just based on the functions that it do for our day-to-day activities, right? We do so many things every day. We, wake up, decide to join a meeting or not to join a meeting, and talking with people, or even listening, like just listening to this talk and processing, or even viewing these images that you're seeing right now. And there are different parts of the brain responsible for that. And so the frontal lobe really is responsible for movement, decision making, me bobbing my head around while I'm talking and moving my hands, starting from the frontal lobe. Parietal lobe really is around sensory processing. So I think like feelings of touch. And occipital lobe kind of goes into like visual processing, like processing images and seeing what's going on. And then that also kind of shares the load across the frontal and parietal lobe. And then the temporal lobe goes into memory and emotion and hearing. So listening to me right now, or thinking back about how this talk went, or even your emotions when reviewing like relationships with people. The temporal lobe is responsible for that. Now, I'll go into like what the brain interfaces are. So first of all, I showed you how the brain is kind of split up. But inside all of these, we have billions of neurons really communicating and sending messages across one another. And when these communications are going on, there's electrical activity that's given off. And so in between, like me deciding to move, although it starts in the frontal cortex of my brain, the next thing is my hands taking like moving around. Like how does that happen? Like data is passed across really from my neurons sending the messages. And then you see electrical signals being given off to me now, moving my hands. And so we can actually like record these electrical signals that are given off when our brain performs actions. And this is essentially what brain interfaces are in the simplest context. It is giving that insight into what is going on when you perform decisions and when when moves are being made. And so on this right side, you can see here a little monkey that is looking at a screen. And it has a little reward thing there going on, which is kind of obviously trying to reinforce behavior. But to give a little background or context into this, this particular, this is a rhesus monkey, and the experiment was started by the Nicoletis lab when they were exploring, what is possible when we actually record data from the brain. So back in the day when things started, I think people just used to record from one electrode only. And so we kind of looked into what happens when we record from multiple electrodes combined together. And they were able to, in this case, have a monkey go ahead and actually grasp and reach for things. And later on in this talk, I'll show you really like, how this work morphed into something a lot bigger and even what it is right now. And now the brain interfaces themselves are kind of split into a couple parts, right? Not everything is just sitting on the brain. The first types of interfaces are the invasive ones. And so the invasive ones actually require surgery and actually have the electrodes being put right in the brain, close to the neurons themselves. And I mean, if you're listening to this right now, you can probably tell why it's not very common, because you need people to be really convinced to put anything in their brains or in their heads, right? And so that's what the invasive ones are. You implant the electrodes and you put them right close to the neurons that are making decisions in the brain. But the benefit of this really is that you get a lot of data, right? Because the electrodes are right there close to when this electrical activity is being given off. When I talk about EEG, you realize the difference between them. But a middle ground between EEG non-invasive and then invasive ones is really the partial invasive devices or interfaces. Here is electrocorticography, and this essentially is opening up the brain a bit and then placing this right on top of the scalp itself. So this is not going in and sitting beside, it's not going into the cerebral cortex, but just kind of sits on top of it. And obviously this gives better data than when you have it just on your head with no surgery. But at the same time too, like this is still surgery happening, so you can imagine the barrier for people wanting to do that. And we have a couple non-invasive methods. There is the first one called the functional magnetic resonance imaging, and this is really I don't know if you've seen any of these devices before, when you have someone sit down with their hands straight and then they move into the device, sit there for a couple minutes. There's someone monitoring the machine that's collecting that data, right, and actually looking into seeing recorded images from the brain. And so these are used in terms of like detecting tumors, and there's a whole like field building on top of this data itself. Now, the next one is FNIRS, which is functional near-infrared spectroscopy. But this is a bit different from the other ones I've mentioned. So in this case, with FNIRS, it's actually sending near-infrared lights to the brain in the form of a cap, really, and trying to measure the concentration of the blood oxygen levels really around the hemoglobin. That is, in simple terms, watching as what tissues absorb light as it moves through the brain itself. And if you notice, the context of all of these brain interfaces, like I said earlier, is perform an event, record activity, and leverage whatever the outcome from that is. And finally, we have electroencephalography, which is EEG, and this is the ones that are most common today. And so we have electrodes on the device, similar to something like this. You can see here, these are very small. See if I can pull them out. There you go. So these are very small electrodes, if you can see these. There we go. And they're placed on different parts of the brain. We'll go over in the couple slides in detail, like how placements work and what placing them in different areas mean. But if you got the context way earlier at the beginning, we have the different lobes performing different actions. And if you wanted to get data related to something, you probably want to place the electrodes around the area itself. And now I'll go into some real world use cases. So I showed earlier the little monkey that was controlling the image on the screen itself. And now way earlier in like 2014, really, which is roughly almost 2014 to now is roughly about like 7 years from now, which is quite some time. But we were able to actually get well, not we, they were able to actually get a person to kick a football, a paraplegic actually, to kick a football again with their legs at the World Cup opening. And they were even able to actually feel the sensory impact of that. And so what this means now is that with brain-computer interfaces, after using recorded brain activity, they were able to perform this. And deep down, what happened was they had, if you look here, they had roughly about 50 to 100 electrodes collecting brain activity, building on top of the work that they had gotten on the results they've gotten from recording data from monkeys, and applying that to actually people with what's it called now? People that find it hard to use their limbs because they've lost the connection between the spinal cord and the other parts of their body. Now, the other parts that are important really is around understanding of neurological disorders. And so with recordings from brain activity, for example, you can essentially tell, like, when if you have a brain computer interface in your head, when someone has like an epileptic seizure, for example, you can even tell what is going on in the brain, what spikes occurred and why. Or you can even apply to other scenarios, really, not just epileptic seizures, but even things like Parkinson's, for example, when you actually have like an overload of um, information being sent out to like different parts of the body, really involuntary action, right? And you can, once you're able to record that type of data, you can actually work to accommodate for that really in itself. Other things here like insights into like attentiveness and focus and calm. You can see this little chart at the bottom here was me when I was cleaning up the slide this morning using this brain interface. So I had it on my head and I was wearing it up, and yeah, there were a couple of distractions here and there. But at the same time, you can see that it was able to one detect periods when I was distracted or periods when I was actually focusing. Behind this data really is from recording the EEG. There are these things called like frequency bands and frequency waves, and so the beta waves, for example, kind of are responsible for like detecting like active thinking or easy thinking or processing and cognition, and so it's kind of listening for those kind of activities from the recorded brain data itself, and going a bit deeper into it. This is another real world use case. About like 3 weeks ago, if anyone's seen or heard about the things that Elon Musk's been doing with Neuralink, they actually do have, and I'm gonna, I think, maybe just play a little video right now if you don't mind. They were able to get a little rhesus monkey to actually play ping pong with their brain in real time. And in this case, it was actually a bit more, quote unquote, a bit more impressive than the previous one I showed you before. So in this case here, they had a whole appendage sitting on their head. But in this new scenario here, the monkey actually did not have any chip on the head. They had actually had the invasive electrode implanted into their brain. And so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and play this bit real quick. And let me know if you can hear the audio too. I may need to reshare again. Let me go ahead and reshare.
This is Paige. He's a 9-year-old.
Oh, we could see the video, and I think the audio was working, but now it's disappeared.
Okay, I tried to just confirm that the audio was in, but I'll go ahead.
Who had a Neuralink placed in each side of his brain about 6 weeks ago. If you look carefully, you can see that the fur on his head hasn't quite fully grown back yet. He's learned to interact with a computer for a tasty banana smoothie delivered through a straw. We can interact with the Neuralinks simply by pairing them to an iPhone, just as you might pair your phone to a Bluetooth speaker. The links record from more than 2,000 electrodes implanted in the regions of Paige's motor cortex that coordinate hand and arm movements. Neurons in this region modulate their activity with intended hand movement. For example, some might become more active when he moves his hand up, and others when he moves it to the right. By recording from many neurons and feeding their activity into a decoder algorithm, we are able to predict Paige's intended hand movements in real time. First, we calibrate the decoder by recording neural activity as Pager uses the joystick to move a cursor to targets presented on the screen. As he's playing this game, we are wirelessly streaming, in real time, the firing rates from thousands of neurons to a computer. Using these data, we calibrate the decoder by mathematically modeling the relationship between patterns of neural activity and the different joystick movements they produce. After only a few minutes of calibration, we can use the output from the decoder to move the cursor instead of the joystick. Pager still moves the joystick out of habit, but as you can see, it's unplugged. He's controlling the cursor entirely with decoded neural activity. Our goal is to enable a person with paralysis to use a computer or phone with their brain activity alone. Because they wouldn't be able to move a joystick, They would calibrate the decoder by imagining hand movements to targets. One of the things the Neuralinks allow Pager to do is to play his favorite video game, Pong. To control his paddle on the right side of the screen, Pager simply thinks about moving his hand up or down. We've removed the joystick altogether. Now that he's up to speed, let's increase the difficulty and see how well Pager can play with the Neuralink. As you can see, Pager is amazingly good at Mind Pong. He's focused, and he's playing entirely of his own volition.
Okay, I think that
It's not magic.
bit.
The reason Neuralink works is because it's recorded.
There we go. So let me go again and then share my screen. But if you saw the video, what was going on behind the scenes, right, was that data was being recorded from their brain activity using an invasive electrode being placed into the skull itself. And then in this case, now they're actually able to then move forward and then go in to presenting and playing the game itself with just his brain. And so the appendages were done, no more recordings going on. Now this is actually the inference part of things. And so this goes on to the next part of the slide that I'm about to go ahead and show. Give me 1 second. Okay, let me know if you can see my screen. Hopefully you can. Okay, great. I see a thumbs up. That means you can. All right. And so now the next part is, how is the brain data actually collected? From that video, you can see that they had actually tried to calibrate the monkey, right, playing with the mind pong itself. And in this part, what happens is they define an experiment, right? Say, oh, we present the monkey with some stimulus and see how, the monkey's brain activity is going when they're actually performing the action. And when you're performing the action, you're actually recording data using electrodes. And so in this case, obviously, at this point, we're focusing a bit more on EEG data itself. And I'll show you like 2 examples. So I have these pair of EEG devices right here. So these have soft electrodes. And with this ones, though, you actually have to put like some gel on it. So yeah, imagine having to put the gel every time you wanted to wear something on and then kind of fitting it up a little bit. It's not so comfortable. And so I don't use this one as often. But these other ones are just dry electrodes. And so I really would just place them right on my skull. 1 sec. I need to fit back the electrode I removed. So we have this here, and then you just place it right on your skull. And what's happening now is with it on my skull, you can see this regions on the map on the left side. And you can see on the right side the brain waves corresponding to the parts of the screenshot I actually recorded. So I recorded this morning. This is just a screenshot from the different areas around the frontal cortex. And you can see the mappings on the screen here that show like, okay, this is the parts of my brain that the data is being recorded from. And so when you record an experiment and you do that, then you have this sort of like time series data of EEG going on from these different channels. And then you now go on to the next part of, okay, how do you actually analyze this, right? Like, how do you make sense of this? And how do you actually turn this from just raw recordings into getting insights from it? And so, as with anything that involves data, there's always the cleaning and pre-processing that happens. And so the first thing in this case is, trying to find timestamps that correspond with events that we care about. Going ahead to remove any noisy data that is involved. Then after removing the noisy data, and in this part, the reason why you have to remove noisy data, and one thing about EEG is that like there's so many, I'll call them artifacts, but think of them as spikes in the data that exist. And so when you actually record EEG, like blinking alone is a whole big spike in a whole jump in the data that you have. And you need to kind of filter out and notch out that data because, as with anything, garbage in, garbage out, right? If you put in the wrong raw type of data, you're going to get bad results out. And so here you have to remove the noisy data by filtering and accounting for this noise I mentioned. And then the next part is trying to decide what channels to use. And so this Fourier transform is one thing that comes in really handy or interesting in this place. And what Fourier transform is doing here exactly is taking that time series data that existed and actually going ahead to get more or less a raw representation or encoding for a bunch of data. So go back to the screen here, and I pick like from here to here right now, this is essentially voltage and time. And then Fourier transform is saying, okay, well, for all of this voltage and time, give me a representation for this that it's almost like passing through like a formula, right? Every time like I see this data, how can I get the raw bits of it itself? And that's what Fourier transform is. And what you then have from there now is you can go ahead and do a spectrogram, which is essentially trying to get the highest frequencies and then saying, okay, you know what, the channel with the best frequency is what I'm going to use. And then you can then feed that into training the model and then generating some predictions from it. Here are a couple tools that you can use when playing around with that. And now I talked obviously in kind of like a wave over like how you claim and how you analyze. I'm going to go ahead and show a little demo, or well, I won't call it demo, I'll call it more like a walkthrough of like the analysis process of, okay, how do I take an experiment and try to actually like apply that in a given scenario with brain interfaces. And so I'm going to go ahead and share this other part of my screen. And this experiment is a bit different though. In this case, I was actually trying to see if I can record my thoughts as text in real time. And so it's an audacious like claim, like talking with other neuroscientists, like I go like, okay, let's see how that works. But essentially what I was trying to do is prompt multiple words to a user and have them start typing. So as I was saying before, you have that period of collecting the data. And so here I would prompt a word to the user, and then when they type it, I show them another word. And when they type it, I show them another word. And while this is happening, I'm collecting like keystroke data from the keyboard. And I'm also collecting brain activity from the headset. And so when I do that, now I have like, a bunch of data streams I'm going to combine together. And so I'll show you right here, and I'll go ahead and like zoom in a bit so it's a bit, people who are using smaller screens can see a bit clearly. What's happening here now is I have a couple of data streams. So I have EEG data, I have keystroke data, and like word prompts. That is the words that have been prompted out. And if you look at the samples of the data, you can see channel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now this my device has 8 channels. Some people's devices could have more, they could have less, because EEG devices are really different. And then the next thing I did was also like looking at the keystroke data. And so this is me like moving my mouse up and down. You can see S down, S up. This is literally a deep press and a release. And so now I need to kind of match these two data sets together to give me one particular data frame. And yes, there are a bunch of to-dos in there if you read through. But essentially what's going here is I create a little label encoder for the words themselves. And then I map these channels to their names from the map I've shown you before. And then getting a pattern based on this down, up, down, up. So for example, C would be S down, S up, E down, E up, E down, E up again. And then after doing that, then I pass this through a function to actually get me the EEG samples for that keystroke data. And what is happening here is essentially just that correlation that I was talking about. So for Python, jumble, easy, difficult, answer, xylophone, these words were picked at random. In reality, the words you may actually want to have them be more methodologically chosen because how the brain thinks about words really differ in the context of the sentence that they used. But essentially, now that I have this pattern, I then went ahead to say filter that and give me the data that actually matches with that. And so what you're seeing over here is the code that does that. Essentially, it's just a pandas. Pandas is a Python data frame, a Python data library really that tries to get for a rolling window, find me the patterns that exist, and then remove the ones that are not part of the pattern. And then this are exactly essentially the word prompt that I need. And so, for example, here is now a single entry of me typing the word easy, 409 rows and 9 columns. This right here, as I was showing you before, think of these as like brainwaves in time, really, right? How do you actually convert this to something you can feed into like an ML algorithm that does make sense, right? Like all of these numbers, if you notice, one, they're kind of relative to themselves. So like this can be negative 5,000, this can be 1,000 or whatever. It's really based on everybody's brain data is actually different. That's one thing to call out, by the way. And so what that means is different experiments would generate different types of raw neural activity, and we'll get into that in a later step. But this is also one of the challenges of working with EEG data itself. But again, I need to also now filter like for noisy artifacts, like I was saying. With the data that has been collected, if you notice the jumps here and like 4 seconds, 4 seconds, it's because there is a sampling rate of 250 hertz. And if you divide 1,000 milliseconds, which makes 1 second, by 250, then that means, we get in every 4 seconds, we get a new data entry for all of the channels themselves. And now filtering here is essentially, like I said, trying to remove the noise. So I did a little transposition here, first of all. But the next thing I went on to do really was to go ahead and just apply a filter. Now, these parts are pretty interesting. If you notice here, I tried another filter here called notching. And what the notch filter is just saying, you know what, disregard any data that occurs within this range. Or I could use like a raw, like this is a different type of filter itself. But essentially what that is doing is giving me my data within the 2 and 30 hertz. And anything above that, just kind of like try and smooth it out on your way away. And so when we do that, we then get like essentially a Fourier transform for a single channel. And what the Fourier transform, like I was saying before, was for a given entry, try to get out a quote unquote a formula for this whole time series data that does exist. So this can vary, right? This data can be, this is 403 rows, another one can be 20 rows, another one can be 1,000 rows. But you want to have on a frequency domain between like 1 to 125 hertz mostly. That is standard all the time. And if you have something standard, you can essentially then start to feed that to models essentially. And so what I went on to do was to try and get like a plotting function again. And so after everything and all this processing, these are for the entries that I had that match with me typing the word easy. And this is the cleaned version of the data. These are the FFT representations, obviously measuring like the power on the power spectrum itself. And so each entry that you see here was me typing easy from one electrode. And the C4 one, I think, is the one usually around here, like the top left side of the brain. And you can merge multiple electrodes together, or if you're people who do like ML, look at combining features together. But here is where like the whole machine learning thing starts to shine in after you've done a lot of cleaning and processing, right? So this is one word, me typing easy, and this is me doing it for another word, me typing xylophone. And now visually, they kind of look different, right? I can obviously, I was looking for a difference in there, so it's easy for me to say that they kind of look different. But also, like if you both look at them side by side, you look at and find out that okay, yes, there is a little difference between both of them. Now at this point, when you have FFT data with labels, with machine learning, you have input data, you have labels. The next thing that you want to do is just fit it into any neural network or any algorithm that you want. But in this case, I was actually trying to be, I guess maybe the word is too fancy, and I was actually trying to play around with GPT in this case to see if it actually gave me any good responses. Spoiler or disclaimer, it didn't. But I think it was also because I had to do a lot of cleaning and actually like tweaking of GPT itself to give me good results. And so the next thing I'm going to do now is actually took a little break and stop trying to be fancy and actually read a book around data-driven computational neuroscience and different methods that neuroscientists have been using, and actually trying to see if any of the naive methods, like just a simple support vector machine or anything of those sorts, can work well with the data that we have. But yeah, that's a little overview. In here, I was just kind of showing you from the slides I talked about earlier that gave a high-level talk of, oh, here are the things that you need to do. This is showing in practice. When I was going through a particular project I was exploring, here's what I did and where things are at the moment. So now I'm going to go back to the presentation itself again. 1 second. Okay, I think the presentation is loaded up. And we're here. So we collected the data as I showed you in that experiment that I walked through. I went ahead and tried to, do some cleaning. I used M&E to do some filtering through it. And, I'm kind of at this point where I'm trying to train a model and generate predictions, but, it's never that easy. If it was, that would have been great. Now, the next part after this is, from all the things I did earlier, what are the things that I'm missing, right? What are the things that makes it hard or holds back from us, everybody, like, just wearing a brain interface and doing whatever they want. And one of the first things are form factors. Like, I mean, I'm working from home, so it's kind of okay for me to wear this while I'm, sitting down at home and I'm doing my stuff. When I'm at the office, maybe I can wear it because, you can come as you are at Microsoft, but it just kind of, it's a bit different, right? It's a little harder to have these devices sitting on your head every time. You probably want better form factors. For example, say when you're running, you wouldn't like have EEG sitting on your head because then it's so noisy and any data that you get in is really poor. And so you can imagine there's this, the team at MIT, they have a fluid interfaces labs. And one of the things that they're exploring is, what happens when you put electrodes around different parts. So maybe instead of having one, or just focusing on EEG from the brain, how about putting electrodes around like glasses and like around the lobes here? And I think they explored that and it did okay, and they had some results from that. But essentially the idea is we want better form factors that combines our modalities together instead of just relying on the data from the brain itself. And another one also here is, more accessible devices. Like these devices, I guess maybe because I'm interested, I'm willing to, put in a little cash here and there to buy these devices and test them out. But these ones, even though I dumped them and I stopped using them as much, cost about like 400 Canadian dollars, which if you add shipping into it, and these other ones cost roughly about like 800 or 900 Canadian dollars. And now I enjoy doing it. I have fun with it. That's why I do it. But in reality, this is a barrier, right? Not everybody has the flexibility or the income to say, you know what, I'm going to shell this much amount of money on playing with these things. But that doesn't mean they cannot do it, right? So we need more accessible devices that enable this to work. And there are open source options that are coming along, but even then, it still costs money because the parts aren't that cheap. But again, if you know about, I've forgotten the name of the person's law, but the longer we go in technology, the cheaper things become. I remember when VR used to need a whole Alienware machine and then a big, couple $1,000 devices, and now you can buy VR headsets for $200 or cheaper. So hopefully we get into that point where brain-computer interfaces are more accessible, and that will be good. But another thing really is the variability in subject data. Yeah, thank you for Moore's law, and so there's variability in subject data from brain recordings. Now, my brain and your brain and another person's brain are different. And when we record that data, you can expect different results. Like that's just kind of how it works. Now, another thing too is that like, apart from that, me recording data right now and recording data 6 hours later in the day after I finished from work, they also return like different results. And so there's a lot of variability involved. And in building these like algorithms or models, you need to account for that. And that is a bit of, head scratching and playing around with things. It is possible, don't get me wrong, but to build a model that generalizes, even with regular machine learning algorithms, it's never really a walk in the park. So this is one of the things that I'm missing. If anybody finds a solution to that, that would be perfect. Actually, I think the folks at Microsoft, Microsoft actually has a brain-computer interface group, by the way. And they started exploring how you can do, repeated runs and get good results out. I'll share a link later in the chat if I can find it again. Another thing too is lowering the learning curve for getting started. One of the reasons why, it took me a while to even get into doing this again or playing around with it from the time I was interested is that a lot of these things just sounded like buzzwords to me when I first started, right? It sounded like big grammar, someone saying, the frontal cortex is this, and then you need to apply some transform and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I just really want to record my data and then just throw it in an ML model and get results out. And so you want to reduce that learning curve for people that are trying to get started. And that's part of the things that they are actually, and you will find in the resources, they are open source options or tools and EEG notebooks that allow you to actually explore neuroscience experiments. That's actually how I got to run in my first cognitive neuro experiments. And it was just, I had Python. I had a headset and then I just ran it. Even if you don't have a headset, there are like raw data sets you can use and start exploring. Another thing really is cross collaboration across institutes. One of the things that's happening right now is people are developing in silos. And there are organizations that have started trying to make things a bit more accessible or more open. And so there's like Open Neuro, there's Allen Institutes, and there are folks that have this, what do you call them, challenges to have more people share data and share results. But this is something that is needed and that is missing for between where we are now and having us, get to a place where people can just wear a brain-computer interface at home, or anyone who's trying to build just easily get started without having to do too much work. And so looking ahead, some of the things that we can make possible with that is one, obviously, integration with IoT devices. This is like one of the easiest things or one of the quickest things you can get out, is because you have data recording when someone's performing an activity, and then you want to repeat that again afterwards when they're thinking of the same thing. And so IoT devices definitely coming into play here will be perfect. And you can see this little example here of somebody else who actually was able to successfully detect blinks using TensorFlow JS in the browser, and exactly the same type of headset, the Neurosity Notion too. And so you can imagine more integration with IoT devices at home and making it a bit easier to interact with the world around us, really. Another one is really insight into emotion regulation. The first thing I showed earlier on was that when I showed the focus on calm stuff, that's just one bit of it, right? You can start to explore more emotions. And I showed you also the parts of the brain that is responsible for that around the temporal lobe. And you can also try and get from the different regions and combining the signals together to get something better. But that's something that is possible that we can get out. The other one also is usage with virtual reality, right? This right here on the bottom is a new device that has been proposed by the folks at OpenBCI, which are an open source community for biosensing devices. And they work together with the MIT Media Lab. By the way, the MIT Media Lab is doing some really amazing stuff. So if you're curious, just check out Fluid Interfaces Lab for MIT. They have people exploring, like I said, different modalities of how do you actually make these things more accessible. And this right here is going to give us something interesting. This is going to give us virtual reality at the same time with the ability to record brain activity. And if you combine these two together, think about the scenarios that we can enable with this. I was talking earlier about how there are clinical uses of brain interfaces, but you can also imagine this for therapy for people, for example, going through PTSD to relieve, some scenarios, or even putting them through different scenarios and at the same time watching what their emotional response is, right? Not giving too much, just enough, right? That you can apply that to PTSD itself. You can apply that to even cases of addiction and trying to wean people off certain experiences themselves. And so this is really, really promising and interesting. Right now, if you wanted to do that, you would have to kind of wear this headset on and at the same time have a virtual reality headset on. It kind of works. It's a bit finicky, but it still does the job depending on how motivated that you are. But devices like this definitely are going to make it easier to interact with, and you can think about how gaming is going to change for anybody who likes playing games, right? Actually fusing in that experience of the user with what you're trying to present them. And finally, the previous project I showed you before was thoughts as text in real time. Now, like I said, what I was trying to do was a bit audacious, or is a bit audacious because I haven't stopped. But I'm limited to like 8 electrodes. The thing I showed you from Elon Musk, the invasive one, has like roughly over 1,000 electrodes sitting right beside the neurons themselves. And so you can imagine how strong fidelity of data you're going to get with is that. And we all know, the better data you get, the better your algorithms are going to be most likely, right? And so having advances in hardware will definitely have a part to play in seeing some of these things being possible. And talking about collaboration and overcoming these barriers that I mentioned earlier. How do you get somebody who just wants to hack on a quick project over a weekend or a week, just get started without needing to talk with neuroscientists or without needing to become a subject matter expert, right? That is a good place to actually start to see a lot more innovation thrive and a lot more things actually come out. And so I've talked about like a lot of good things from brain interfaces. I think I've been preaching for a while now, but there are some things that raise eyebrows. And I think for me the first part is like neuromarketing. And neuromarketing is a bit interesting because it's one, leveraging recordings like this that I mentioned and data from this to help sell ads. To make life to put it bluntly, right? Is helping selling ads. And for anyone who's used like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and all of these devices, you notice that sometimes like it's not that like ads are bad, but it's just that sometimes you just may not want to see ads at the moment, right? Or not just you don't want ads that are too targeted. So for example, I turn off like targeted ads on any device or any social media platform I use because I don't want to feel like something else is influencing my decision making and my actions. And you can imagine now that you have actual real brain recordings, right, paired with whatever data from browsing activity, these start to become a bit too invasive or too much, in my opinion. And so here's where it also gets interesting again that the good thing about devices and how people are building is one, starting to think of this from the beginning, right? And keeping data on the user's devices. And so here right now on this Notion device I have, you can actually run machine learning on your device. It actually has a chip inside of it where you can do inference. And so the things I was showing you about focus and calm, really the inference was happening right on the device. And then what was being sent over the API was just the computed outcome. And so the brainwaves never leave your device and stay with you all along. We can start also, I mean, if anyone's interested, I'm just going to throw this idea out there, is like, how do you like sign your brain data, right? People have been talking about NFTs and stuff like that. I don't know if that's possible, but again, it's how do you make sure that when your data is being stored, one, you still maintain ownership, like as much as possible. Like it's always good to put power in the hands of the users, right? And also because then you can always say no or delete your data whenever you like, in line with GDPR, wink, wink. And so the other parts really is what scenarios are we trying to enable? Like when you're giving your data out, right? Because beyond what I said, there are people who try to do research programs, right? And there's some research programs that I also actually join. And there's some open source type research programs that go on. And so it's like when you're doing this, like what scenarios are you enabling with this data? Like just being sure about what is my data being given up for, and also like what are the rewards for participating in research? Like, are you just going to pick up people's like you can't do it the way people did, like getting data from faces, right? Just crawling Twitter, crawling social media, and building like face net algorithms and saying, yeah, we have the best state of the art models. You can't do that with brain data because it's super personal, right? This is literally coming from electrical activity as your neurons are performing things, right? And so you want to make sure that one, whoever's performing research consents to it, and you make sure that the user stays in control of whatever happens with the data afterwards. And now I've gone through a lot, and at this point, hopefully you're sold, and you're looking or interested to get involved. And these are a couple resources. The Neuro-Tech EDU, this is literally one of the links I clicked on when I was getting started and just reading through. It has very, very deep and detailed breakdowns of literally how the brain works, the nervous system, devices, even going in a bit deeper. This goes into a bunch of resources that you can check out. And the EEG notebooks was what I mentioned earlier, right? Just easily spinning up Python and trying out EEG experiments is the EEG notebooks. And another thing really is, I think for me, it made it a lot easier being a part of a community, like having people to reach out to ask for help. Like the project I was showing you earlier, I had someone from the Neuro-Tech community that I used to ping every like Sunday or so. We would have meetings, and it's just me asking like dumb questions, like being vulnerable, like what you would call dumb, right? And just asking people questions, getting answers out from them, and trying to move forward and make progress. So I would say join the community if you're interested. Neuro-Tech X is a pretty good place to get started. Most people are very welcoming over there and willing to help. Another one is the Neuromatch Academy. Neuromatch Academy is it's a program that happens roughly every couple of months. And the Neuromatch Academy every year actually, by the way, and they're having one in a couple months actually. And so if you're interested, click the link, try and sign up. And you can also send me a message really. If you're trying something out and you have some questions, feel free to ping me. If you want to work in something together for the hackathon and you have good ideas, always happy to collaborate. And so, yeah, thank you all for listening. Hope you're so